Hello, biology. The purpose of this video is to give students who either miss class or maybe I was going too fast an opportunity to get finished up, or simply if we did not have an opportunity to get these notes finished up in class and you needed to do them on your own time, this is that opportunity. Okay, chapter 16. There are some years that I choose not to cover chapter 16. It's pretty complicated stuff. It gets into genetic drift, and it does relate evolution to genetics. It's just really difficult for some kids to understand. But as I've said many times this year, I'm going to stretch evolution out. Evolution's got I have a lot of cool activities. Evolution is something that many students can kind of understand because it's easy to relate how having advantages give you characteristics give you certain advantages. In any event, I'm covering 16.2 and 16.3. 16.2 kind of gets into genetic drift and how alleles or characteristics become more common in populations, and then 16.3 is a really big one because that talks about speciation, how new species actually come to be over time. In any event, here we go. We're restarting our numbering back to number 1 for chapter 16. Please do them in Cornell note style. And again, I will be going faster than I normally do in class because you can always pause the video. All right, here we go. So we're going to abbreviate natural selection as NS. Remember, org stands for organisms. You'll see ENV. That means environment. So how does natural selection affect organisms? Nature, the environment, chooses the organisms that survive and get to reproduce and then pass on those good traits. So if you are successful in your environment, it's not like Mother Nature is sitting up there on the chair going, okay, you get to survive, not you, you're dead. But the characteristics in the environment, the competition going on in that specific ecosystem, those are the things that select organisms to survive or organisms to die. Okay, definition, gene pool. It is exactly what it says. It is a pool, a collection of all of the genes in a population. Remember, population is same species, same place, same time. Okay, so many of you guys have to drive through the neighborhoods to get to Rio. You guys see those turkeys? That is a population. Same place, same species, same time. Now, on the other side of the river, over by the Backasac State, where I live, we also have a population of turkeys, wild turkeys. So those are two different populations, same species, but they're different populations because they're in different locations. All right, moving ahead. Okay, so how is the gene pool affected by reproduction? So if an organism dies without reproducing, maybe because it doesn't have a good characteristic or maybe it has a weak characteristic, the genes for that bad trait leave the gene pool. All right. And if all of the organisms with that bad trait over 100 or 1,000 generations end up dying and not passing on the genes for that bad trait, then all of a sudden that characteristic is no longer possible in that population. Right, if an organism survives longer, more of the genes for that good trait get passed on to the offspring. That makes sense. And then over time, the frequency of whenever I say genes or alleles or traits, they all mean the same thing. Genes code for proteins. Proteins give the actual organism those traits, usually morphological traits that you can see in their structure. And remember, alleles are just different forms of a gene, a dominant form or a recessive form. So when you see genes or alleles or traits, they all really mean the same thing. But over time, the frequency of those good genes, alleles, traits can increase in a population. And the frequency of the bad genes, alleles, or traits can decrease in the population. And potentially over many generations leave the population. And if you don't have the genes, alleles, or traits, and there's no reproduction of those traits going on, then eventually they're going to be gone from the population. All right, moving ahead. All right, evolution and allele trait frequency. So evolution is any change over time in the relative frequencies of alleles or traits in a population. Because remember, alleles or traits code for those characteristics. Well, traits are those characteristics. Genes and alleles code for those characteristics. You understand what I mean. Do populations or individuals evolve? Individuals do not evolve. Okay, individuals don't evolve. Lamarck said that individuals evolve. Okay, in the same generation. Okay, Lamarck was wrong. Okay, populations evolve. The overall makeup, the overall genetic makeup, the overall characteristics in that group of organisms, that's what changes over time. And it changes by the good traits becoming more and more common through reproduction and survival, and the bad traits becoming less and less common through lack of reproduction or lack of survival. Well, of course, if you don't survive, you can't reproduce. All right, moving ahead. All right, organism color and allele frequency. So here's an example. So certain organisms of one color may produce fewer offspring than organisms of other colors. And that can happen just simply through mutations. Not necessarily that it's a good characteristic and it gives you an advantage in nature, but it can happen at random. And that's why this chapter is kind of confusing, is because genetic drift, which we'll start talking about in just a little bit, genetic drift is not predictable. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's random, okay? And random things sometimes don't make sense. So, for example, a lizard population is normally brown, but it has mutations that produce red and black forms. Okay, not because red ones are able to blend into their environment or are stronger or smarter, not because black ones are able to blend into their environment or are stronger or smarter. It just mutations produce different forms. Okay. All right, so how's that related to survival and reproduction? Red lizards are more visible to predators. So that means they survive and reproduce less. And that means that the allele for red color will become rare and maybe over time will even leave the population completely. So remember, when we talk about mutations, typically we associate them as being a negative thing, okay? They're not always a negative thing. The variation in the human population, I mean, just even with like cohort A or cohort B separate, and I know in a week and a day they're going to be together, but there's huge variation in the appearances of my students. And of course, you all look different than me too. Those mutations over thousands of generations have led to these changes in characteristics. Okay, and just because your skin color is different than another doesn't necessarily mean that you have an advantage in nature. Like I said, humans are kind of an odd example because of our intelligence and our ability to manipulate our environment to make it allow for life. That's going to get a little bit harder in the coming decades, but in any event. All right, you guys, moving ahead. Okay, natural selection determines which organisms blank and which do not. You might want to take a look at number 3. First couple bullets for number 3. Oh, my bad. No, take a look back at number 1. Yeah, it's fitness. It's survival and reproduction. All right, if an organism dies, what happens to its alleles? What happens to those genes? Do they get passed on? No, of course they don't. If the organism dies, it doesn't get to reproduce anymore, and those traits will not get passed on to offspring. All right, evolution is a change in the relative blank in a population over time. Take a look at number 4. Yeah, it's relative allele frequencies or gene frequencies or trait frequencies. Again, those are all synonymous. They all kind of mean the same thing in this conversation. All right, let's move ahead. All right, so genetic drift, we're going to abbreviate that as GD. It is a random change in allele frequency. And again, the reason why genetic drift is difficult for some kids to understand is it's like, whoa, that organism doesn't have any characteristics that really give it an advantage in its environment. Why are there more of them than these guys? It's random. It doesn't necessarily make sense. It's not logical, okay? But it is there. Genetic drift in good traits in some small populations. Usually genetic drift is found in small populations. Organisms with bad traits sometimes produce more offspring. Not necessarily because they survive more, but maybe they just reproduce more. Who knows? It's random, unexpected. All right, so over time, what does this mean? These random events might make bad traits more common in a population just by chance. All right, moving ahead. All right, more about genetic drift. It can also happen when a small group of individuals colonizes a new habitat. So let's say that there's a lot of competition going on in a given environment, and a group of organisms says, "The heck with this, man! Let's see if we can go find a different place to live. Where we're not getting beat up so much, and we can actually get more food, and get maybe some more breeding opportunities, whatever the case may be." They leave, all right, and they migrate, and then they come into a new habitat, all right, and the idea is that they are the only ones of that species there. They have eliminated that competition. All right, so how? They may carry alleles in different frequencies. So remember, genetic drift doesn't allow you to predict what types of alleles and what types of characteristics because it's random, okay? So if this migratory group has different frequencies or commonalities of these alleles than the population they left from, then over time, they will develop characteristics that are different from the parent population, okay? Not necessarily ones that are advantageous, but just different. And given enough time, they may become so different than the parent population that if they decided to go back and visit, and some bow chicka bow wow reproduction happened between those two populations, if they can't produce viable, livable offspring, then speciation has taken place. And we'll get into speciation in section 16-3. But if your DNA becomes different enough over time that you can't reproduce and produce viable offspring, viable basically means that offspring has to be able to reproduce on its own, then you're different enough to become a different species. Okay, the founder effect. When allele frequencies change due to migration of a small subgroup of a population. So one of the... I don't want to get into that. Never mind. All right, moving ahead. Blank blank is the random change in allele frequency in a population. You might want to take a look back at number 8. Yeah, we're talking about genetic drift. Genetic drift is not always related to a successful adaptation because it can sometimes be blank. You might want to take a look at number 9, 10. Can be random, unexpected. The founder effect is when a small population blanks to a new area and the frequencies of the alleles change from the parent population. You might want to take a look at number 13, 12. Yeah, it's when they migrate to a new area. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the notes. I'm not sure when these are going to be due because I'm doing this video well in advance of even lecturing in class. All right, you guys be safe, and we will either see you in class or in the Zoom.